A few weeks through a series entitled, Let the Little Children Come to Me, and Other Inconvenient Things That Jesus Said. And we've been talking about the call of Jesus to be a church and a people who are very intentional about inviting children and about being like children. We're going to continue reading today from Matthew chapter 18. We started this passage last week, but it's got some more to say to us. So let's jump in here in Matthew 18. You'll recognize the first verses from last week, and then we're going to read on from there. And Matthew writes this. He says, "At that time the disciples came to Jesus and asked, 'Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?' Then Jesus called a little child over to sit among the disciples and said, 'I assure you that if you don't turn your lives around and become like this little child, you will definitely not enter the kingdom of heaven. Those who humble themselves like this little child will be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven.'" That's what we talked about last week, right? We talked about the call to be humble like children, to recognize our dependence and our reliance on God. Jesus goes on from there, though. He says this. He says, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. As for whoever causes these little ones who believe in me to trip and fall into sin, it would be better for them to have a huge stone hung around their necks and be drowned in the bottom of the lake. How terrible it is for the world because of things that cause people to trip and fall into sin. Such things have to happen. But how terrible it is for the person who causes those things to happen. Be careful that you don't look down on one of these little ones. I say to you that their angels in heaven are always looking into the face of my Father who is in heaven. What do you think? If someone had 100 sheep and one of them wandered off, wouldn't he leave the 99 on the hillsides and go in search of the one that wandered off? And if he finds it, I assure you, he is happier about having the one sheep than about the 99 who did not wander off. And in the same way, my Father in heaven does not want to lose one of these little ones." And that's the word of the Lord for us as we worship today. Jumping into your sermon notes, and again, these are in your bulletin if you want to follow along. Your first sermon note is this. Jesus calls us to three attitudes which shape our actions towards the children around us. And the first is this, from verse 5. An attitude of welcome. Jesus is very specific that we are called to welcome, to invite, to bring in children. And so the question is, what does it mean to welcome someone? It's certainly simple enough for me to walk up to someone and say, "Hey, Maxine, welcome." And then I can kind of go on about my business, right? Because I've welcomed her. I'm sure we have all been in situations where someone has welcomed us, they've spoken the word, but then their actions from that point on clearly are not actions of love. And so the challenge for us is to think about what does it mean to truly welcome children, both as individuals and as a church community. To welcome is to open our lives to children and to walk with them in their lives. It's not simply a word, and it's not simply a one-time action. Welcome is about sharing life together. And both as individuals and as a church, that is essential. I don't know if you remember a few weeks ago, we talked about several items that are really important for kids if they're going to be growing into people who live out their faith. And one of them was that they have a place of ministry in the church. And so when we talk about welcoming children into the church, it's not just saying we're going to have a program for them. It's saying they are going to be a part of all that we do. They're going to be ministering with us. They're going to be sharing with us in worship. They're going to be leading us in tongues. Because we need that, and they need that as well. And that's the first attitude that Jesus calls us to in this passage. Now, he goes on from there into a an image that's kind of disturbing. I hope y'all were a little disturbed as we read through it. You know what I'm talking about here? He says, if anyone causes one of these little ones to stumble, it would be better if they had a millstone tied around their neck and they're thrown into the sea. That's not friendly, warm Jesus. On the other hand, what it is it's Jesus saying how important it is that we serve as examples who point children towards faith. And so that's your second sermon note here. The second thing that attitude Jesus calls us to is an attitude of support. And to support is to live our lives in such a way as mimicking our lives will draw children to God rather than away from God. And so we need to be asking ourselves this question on a regular basis. If a child is watching what I do and mimicking what I do, is that going to bring them closer to God or is that going to pull them away? Paul says in Corinthians, he says, follow me as I follow Christ. And I found something very interesting that a lot of people in the church don't want to say that. A lot of us are really uncomfortable saying, hey, follow me as I follow Christ. Because we think, well, I'm not good enough. Or I don't have it together well enough. Or I don't have all the answers. And all of those things are true. Yet, when we think about our children, they will be following you. That's what kids do. They look at the people around them and they mimic them. And so the question is, where are they going to get when they follow you? Where's that going to take them? Is that going to bring them closer to Christ, or is it going to pull them away? You may not want to be an example, but you are an example. And so live the best you can is that example. Now, certainly we're all going to have mistakes, and we're all going to get to places in our lives where we look back and say, boy, I wish I'd done that differently. Thank God for grace in those moments. But as we live each day, day to day, we live with the realization that we are an example to those around us. That's going to spur us on to follow Jesus a little more closely on our own. All right. The third attitude that Jesus calls us to here is an attitude of shepherding. He talks about the flock of 100 sheep. And if there's one sheep that strays away, the shepherd is going to pursue that sheep. The shepherd is going to go after that sheep and try to bring that one sheep back into the fold. And so this is part of our task here. We help keep the lambs near the great shepherd and join in seeking those who wandered away. If you're thinking about this flock, there's 99 who are trying to keep focused on the shepherd, and then there's the one who we need to seek out and help bring back to the shepherd. And both of those, for any of you who have ever kept livestock, you know both of those can be a lot of work. It's not just one that's a challenge. We are not the great shepherd. Jesus himself is the great shepherd. But we are invited to be a part of this work. If you think about Peter who was the leader of the apostles, Peter was given this great instruction after Jesus' resurrection. Peter, if you remember his story, he had denied Jesus. He had said, no, I don't know him, 3 times. And then 3 times after Jesus' resurrection, he comes to Peter and says, 3 times, do you love me? And as Peter says, well, yes, of course, Lord. Jesus tells him, feed my sheep. Take care of my lambs. Feed my sheep. And that instruction to Peter is the same as the instruction to us. We are invited to feed the lambs of God. That's part of our call as the church. The question is, are we willing to accept that call? And if we accept it, what do we do with it? What do we do with this call to feed God's sheep? It's one thing if we could go home and put a meal on the table in front of somebody. That's a pretty clear way to feed somebody. But that's not the only thing that Jesus is talking about here. And when he talks about what it means for him to be the great shepherd, he gives this great picture of what it means to be the good shepherd. He says this in John chapter 10. He says, I am the good shepherd. I know my own sheep, and they know me. My sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they follow after me. And so if we think about the difference between the sheep that has wandered off and the sheep that has stayed near, it's the sheep who stay near, they know the voice of the great shepherd. Those who've wandered off, somehow the voice is not one they recognize. And so when it comes to thinking about our role in tending the lambs that God has entrusted to us, it becomes pretty clear that teaching them the great shepherd's voice is what we need to be about. Listen to this. This is your next sermon. A sheep follows their shepherd because they know the shepherd's voice. And so we need to teach children to know Jesus' voice and follow him. As much as they're going to look to us for examples, our ultimate goal as the church is not that they follow us, but that they follow Jesus. And so, in order to get them to a place where they're following Jesus, we need to be those who are an example of what it means to hear the voice of Jesus Christ and point the kids towards hearing that voice. There's a great story in 1 Samuel chapter 3 that paints a picture of how this works. And this is the story about Samuel when he was a young boy and he was serving the priest, the high priest at the time, whose name was Eli. And in 1 Samuel chapter 3, Samuel is laying down to go to bed. And as he puts his head down, he hears someone call his name. Now, thinking this is Eli, he pops up out of bed and he runs across the way to where Eli is sleeping and says, hey, Eli, 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 Eli. Y'all know any little kids who do this? Eli, 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 Eli. That's how it goes in my house anyway. Finally, Eli, rubs the sleep out of his eyes and he's thinking, what on earth is going on here? And Samuel says to him, Eli, you called me. And Eli kind of gets this furrowed expression on his brow and says, I didn't call you, Samuel. Go back to bed. And so Samuel heads back to bed, and he lays down, and it's not long before he hears someone calling his voice again, Samuel, Samuel. So he hops up and I heard it. And he runs back to Eli and says, Eli, 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 Eli. You read that, Eli? No. Now, at this point, I think probably Eli's getting a little bit grumpy about this. I mean, he fell asleep, woke up, fell asleep, woke up. But instead of being frustrated with Samuel, he simply says to him, Samuel, I didn't call you. Go back to sleep. And then he has this realization. As the high priest, he realizes, wait a second. Maybe this is God. Maybe this is God calling Samuel. Maybe this is a moment where I can teach Samuel how to hear the voice of God. And so he says to him, Samuel, go back and lay down. And if you hear someone call your name again, say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. And that's exactly what Samuel does. He goes back and he lays his head down, and as he's laying there, God calls to him again and says, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel, instead of running to Eli this time, says, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. And that's where God calls him. That's where God begins to speak to Samuel about his ministry and his life and the ways that Samuel is going to serve God. And all of that comes about because Eli recognizes my role is to teach him to hear God's voice. See your next sermon note here. Instead of being frustrated with losing sleep, Eli listened and could see that God was working in the life of the young boy disturbed in slumber. And this is a really important place for us to start. I speak as somebody who was up most of the night with my youngest child. When our kids wake us up, whatever they do that's disturbing us, maybe they're dancing down the aisle in the middle of church and we're thinking it's time to be solemn. Whatever they're doing that frustrates us or disturbs us or makes us grumpy, we need to look and say, how can in this situation can I point this child towards God? How can I help them to hear the voice of God or see what God is doing in this situation? Instead of being worried about what I'm losing, what I'm missing, how can I help that child to encounter Christ in this moment? If we start with that attitude, we're going to be in a much better place to get to this spot where Eli points Samuel towards God. All right, your final sermon note is this. Eli had many flaws. If you have a couple minutes this week, open up 1 Samuel. Read the first 3 or 4 chapters. You will not be impressed with Eli. He was the high priest, but he blew it in so many ways. But despite all the ways that he messed up, all the issues in his life, his legacy is this. He taught Samuel to hear the voice of God. Samuel becomes the lead character in the story from this point on. There's 2 books in the Bible named after Samuel because he is such an important figure in the life of the people of Israel during this time. He led them. He was the judge. He was the voice of God as the prophet. He was the one who anointed the first kings. And all of that came because Eli taught him to hear the voice of God. And so my hope is that we can be Eli's here. Not that we have as many flaws as Eli did, but that we can recognize, you know what? I'm not a perfect person. But my legacy, the thing that I want to hang on after I am long gone, is that I taught these children to hear the voice of God. And that changed their lives. Because it will. You can teach kids all the right things. You can drag them to church against their will if they don't want to come. There's all sorts of things you can do. But chief among those is teaching them to hear God. Because once they get in touch with God for themselves, you're not going to be able to stop their pursuit of Jesus Christ. And so, the question for us then, as individuals and as a church, is how do we do this? Step 1 is work on hearing God for ourselves. If we can't recognize God's voice, it's awfully hard for us to teach someone else to do it. We're going to be having an encounter group starting on the 27th. It's a 10-week group focused on different disciplines of Christian faith, prayer, scripture reading, fasting, all those things. That's a good way to start if you want to work on hearing God for yourself. And the second thing to do is just to make it a priority. Ask yourself, how is God at work in the lives of these kids? Because you'll be amazed at the way God shows up in kids' lives. And we have a choice of either kind of squashing that or downplaying it, or saying, wow, that's incredible. Tell me more about how God is speaking to you. Tell me more about how you're praying. Let's see if we can hear the voice of God. So the question I want you thinking about today, and this is on your connection card too. I'd love to hear your reflections. How will you help those around you to recognize the voice of God? In general, if we don't make a plan, we don't do it. So what's something you're going to do? Could be as simple as reading Scripture with someone. It's a good way to recognize God's voice because you're hearing it right now. What are you going to do to be a part of an Eli congregation that is raising up Samuels to change the world?